Okay, so we got a few more folks here. I think we can probably get started. Good morning, everybody. Matt Levitt. I'm the agronomist with the University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative. And today is the Winter Camelina Economic and Environmental Clusters of Opportunity call, or ECO program call. So really pleased that you carved out some time this morning to learn a little bit more about Winter Camelina and this program in general. If at any time you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat as we're going along here, and I'll field those questions here as we're going. Also from our team here, we've got Sienna Nesser, who's really instrumental in ECO, as well as many other projects here on campus, and then colleague Andrew Leach as well, who's on the commercialization side as well. So really pleased to have you all here. And just to kind of level set a little bit, to give you a sense of why we're here and why we're on this call, I'm going to give you a little bit more background on a program that's newly hosted from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. But just to give you a little background on where these calls are happening and kind of the future direction here. So yesterday we had a intro call on winter barley that was recorded, as will all of these grower calls. So if you happen to miss something or want to go back and look at it, we'll be recording all these presentations and then throwing them up on YouTube and some other places too. So just as a call out there, next week we've got a call on Kernza, or intermediate, an improved variety of intermediate wheatgrass. So if you have an interest in that crop, like to get a little bit more introduction to that crop, we'll have that call next week. And then we're going to finish out this webinar series with Joachim Wiersma and Richard Magnuson talking about hybrid rye next week, Wednesday. So what is the ECO program? The ECO program is why I am here, and my position is funded from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and it's to support and de-risk these 4 crops that we're having the presentations on. So my specific charge is to provide technical assistance in agronomy for Kernza, winter barley, hybrid rye, and winter camelina. And the whole goal of the Forever Green program is kind of, writ large, is a consortium of, R&D efforts at the university to roll out both planting and also commercialization pathways for these new and emerging crops. And the whole focus of the Forever Green program is to, improve water quality around the state of Minnesota and region wide, but the ECO program really focuses just on the state of Minnesota specifically. Keeping that brown soil covered year round, keeping living roots in the soil, and dealing with issues such as nitrogen leaching, and gaining all those benefits that we've all heard about cover crops, but adding economic return to the equation as well. So all the crops in our portfolio, whether they're perennial or winter annual, have a harvestable component to them that we're working very hard to kind of build commercialization pathways on. So growers have, can plug those holes in their rotation and get economic return beyond just the benefits of cover crops. So, we're really targeting areas of the state that have impaired water qualities and kind of protecting the drinking water supply, both for metro areas, but also for rural areas as well. So the map on the left is a map of all the drinking water supply management areas of the state. And it encompasses most of the state of Minnesota. So these are really the focused areas that we're focusing on when we're rolling out this ECO program. So in essence, what it does is it provides an ecosystem service payment for those 4 crops that I mentioned, in addition to kind of a rudimentary crop insurance in the event that the crop fails or there's marketing issues. So it's really outcomes based, and it's, kind of, again, convening all these university and local and regional partners to disseminate these crops and hopefully lower barriers for farmers utilizing kind of the pilot stage of these crops. So the map on the right-hand side of Minnesota is the ECO Round 2 program, where we're really focusing the target of planting these crops. So it supports early farm adoption for those 4 crops that I mentioned. And it's targeting areas of the state with impaired water quality across the state. So again, this is ecosystem service payments, but it's also, building the capacity for farmers to get some economic return from utilizing these crops as well. So as part of that program, it is only eligible for folks within Minnesota. So unfortunately, we can't offer this program to folks, in Iowa or Wisconsin, but we're definitely willing and able to partner with you or to try to build capacity with these crops, because we realize that agriculture doesn't stop at state boundaries. So we really want to be a viable partner for those folks in this meeting outside of those areas. Please feel free to still connect with us, whether it's for resources, et cetera. But this position funds my technical assistance, as well as 2 different types of payments that I mentioned, including seed and grain testing. And our goal is to plant 5,000 acres of all 4 of these crops by 2024. So we're well on our way, but really hope that this is kind of an introduction to some of you that may have an interest in these programs and these crops to kind of lower barriers to plant them moving forward. So if you have an interest in signing up for this program, or you'd like more information, please feel free to visit this website. My colleague Santa will throw that website in the chat as well. Feel free to also reach out via email, give me a call, and we can chat more about that as well. So appreciate it. And with that, we're going to have a little bit of a different format today here. So we've got the crop on the table today is winter camelina, which is a winter oilseed, very much related to canola and other oil seeds like that. And it's a winter annual, so it has all those cover crop benefits that we talked about just a little bit. So it's keeping brown soil covered, providing pollinator habitat, reducing nitrogen leaching, but it gives a harvestable crop at the end, which is an oil seed. And it's very winter hardy, so it has a lot of play as a cover crop as well. But a lot of large major oil companies are also very interested in this crop as well, because it provides a biodiesel feedstock for those processes, and it's a very positive carbon accounting for those types of companies. So a lot of them are very interested in scaling up this crop. So we're going to have 2 folks speak today. We have Matthew Ott from University of Minnesota, postdoc researcher on winter camelina. He's going to talk a little bit about the agronomics and kind of future direction of breeding. And then we've got a grower who has actually truth tested this, Ann Schwager, who's going to be giving us a little background on her experience growing this crop. And so I will pass things over to Matthew. I'll have you screen share and you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks a bunch, Matt. And I will screen share. Actually start this here. That was a great introduction. Thanks again, Matt. And so like Matt said, related to canola, it's in the mustard family. There are both winter and spring type camelina. And there's even kind of something called a semi-winter or a facultative. And I'll talk more about that when it comes to the breeding. But the winter types will form a little disc of leaves after planting, kind of like a dandelion, without this stem. And they'll just sit there in the field until they are exposed to at least about a month of cold temperature. And that is kind of their built-in genetic mechanism to protect themselves from winter, from the cold of winter when they're most vulnerable, which is at the flowering stage. So that's one of their strategies for surviving winter. The spring types don't have this genetic mechanism, and they'll start to flower right away. And if you plant them in the fall, they die. So yeah, we have both. We're looking, still looking at both for the breeding program. I'll talk more about that later as well. But yeah, the winter type's extremely freeze hardy, very resilient and adaptable. I've seen them do well all the way up on the Canadian border up in Roseau, in past experiments I've done. High yielding, high oil content. The seed can be 35 to like close to 40% oil. Oh yeah, we got it in the text there. And seed yield, you know, if we get a good rain and everything lines up in terms of environmental factors, yeah, it can be 1,800 pounds plus per acre. It's heart healthy oil. It's high in omega-3, so it's edible. I think there's still kind of work getting grass status, like the generally recognized as safe for all types of Camelina. There is generally recognized as safe for one spring type of Camelina already. So yeah, that's kind of an area of work. But yeah, there has been some marketed because this one spring line has had the grass status, but also used in jet fuel, and renewable diesel is kind of been a game changer technology in the past few years, making, you know, plant oils that are indistinguishable from diesel. So you don't, it's different than biodiesel. You don't have to worry about, you know, low temperature, like where we are in Minnesota, being an issue in terms of performance in a diesel engine. Renewable diesel can turn Camelina oil into something indistinguishable from diesel. So I mentioned, yeah, the winter type, it forms this little disc of leaves called the rosette. You plant it in early to mid-September, and it'll just sit like that. It'll look like that again in early April, and it'll begin bolting in early May. And our current line of Camelina Joelle will start flowering in mid-May, and you can see the vernalization, this cold exposure, like basically winter, in the months in this little chart, and how it relates to maturity. The BBCH scale is, yeah, phenology related to maturity of the crop. So canola, it's very similar in winter rate to winter Camelina. In a lot of systems that will work for growers in Minnesota, relay cropping is a good strategy for kind of maximizing the yield of the cover crop Camelina and then the following crop, oftentimes soybean. Soybean seems to do better in a relay cropping system where it's directly no-till planted into the standing Camelina in early May, where you would typically plant, you know, soybean at a time you would typically plant soybean. They have this period of overlap for about a month or a month and a half, where they grow together. There's a little bit of shade coming down on the soybean in this system, and that can be a slight stressor on the soybean. But you harvest our Joelle in later June, and that opens up the canopy for soybean to have full light exposure and continued growth. So you can get 2 crops in 1 year or 3 crops in 2 years. It's having vegetative landscape on the land year round. And so that's protecting the soil and sucking up a lot of nitrogen, scavenging phosphorus. So there's both economic and environmental benefits of this system. And Best management practices. You can do no-till or till, and you can drill or broadcast. We've typically seen drilling does a little bit better in terms of stand establishment, but you have to be careful with seeding depth on that as well. So 1/2 to 3/4 inch. And if you go deeper than 3/4 inch, you're going to have spotty establishment. So that's, something to keep in mind. Broadcasting can also be a challenge. You need a little bit of light incorporation to have good seed soil contact. Otherwise, you're also going to have spotty establishment. Planting date for this commonly grown variety of Camelina called Joel, early to mid-September. And yeah, if there are any questions too, during any of what I'm saying, feel free to jump in, but I'll just kind of keep going through and you can ask questions at the end as well.
Yeah, Matthew, well, one thing that came up for me as I've kind of been in this position is talked to a few folks that had 4 stands of Camelina on conventional ground, and found out that it was, some combination of dry weather, not leaching chemicals out, and using chemistry that had a pretty long residual, so that's another consideration to think through as well. If you're wanting to grow Camelina, you got to be really pay careful attention to what your herbicide chemistry is.
Yes. Yeah, I know group 2 and group 14 can be challenging for Camelina as a residual effect. And yeah, I think some of the HPPD herbicides can also be a challenge. So yeah, definitely.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. You go ahead.
There was a question on what equipment needs that you had. Like, did you need to buy new equipment or could you use what you had? I know Ann will probably give some real world information there, but on a research plot perspective, how did traditional equipment work out?
Yeah, so for research plots, yeah, I think I won't get too deep in the weeds. I could, but I won't. For breeding, we have to plant different lines in every row, and that can be a little bit of a challenge getting the depth right. But for larger scale stuff like what growers would do, a drill like a Truax, can do pretty well. You get good stands with that. I think Great Plains drill, those can make good stands of Camelina. So in terms of drills, those 2 I think are kind of pretty proven for us to work well. And I think something else that can be a challenge in terms of planting is the amount of tillage, that you have can also potentially cause some issues. I think if it's pretty heavily worked and you get a heavy rainfall, you can have some crusting issues. So I know a lot of the work they do here in, well, I'm saying here in Morris because I'm here in Morris right now. I had another thing this morning, a field tour. But yeah, here in Morris, they do a little more kind of a light chisel plow type tillage. And so you have a little lighter tillage can kind of reduce crusting, I think, as well. So yeah, another thing to keep in mind. But in terms of, crop residue, corn residue is, of course, more of a challenge than wheat residue. And you have a little bit more removal of corn stover, you get better stands of Camelina. In wheat, if you're kind of planting in the same direction, the row as wheat, if you kind of end up landing a row right on top of another row of wheat stubble, you can have delayed germination and establishment of that row of the Camelina. So if possible, if you can go perpendicular, that might be something. I think that needs to be studied a little more too. But just I'm kind of talking about some observations I've made as well, that haven't been formally studied on a large scale. But yeah, just kind of mentioning some observations, but typically, wheat stubble isn't an issue. And the corn residue, it is good to have some of it removed if possible. In terms of fertility, I think applying in the spring seems to be a good time, and you're probably losing a little bit less as well if you apply in the spring versus the fall. And Russ did this study on the amount to put in, and split application can also be a good approach as well, as you can see in this figure here. I think this also needs to be a little bit further studied, but there isn't a huge difference between the spring and the fall spring split. There is a little bit of a difference, but it's not huge. So, up to a grower, if it's cost effective to make an extra pass for this amount of gain you might see. In terms of diesel you'll use and everything, but around that 60 pound per acre for urea. Well, that's total N. So you have to adjust your urea accordingly, or whatever form of nitrogen you're putting on, but the 60 pounds of N is the key, however you're getting it on. We typically do in our research urea, but it's more workable for us on in a small plot level. But their urea works well, but I know other studies have used other forms of nitrogen, and the key is just the 60 pounds per acre. And getting into the timeline in a little more detail here, mid-September is, I'd say, ideal for planting winter Camelina. As it gets further north, maybe on the kind of Canadian border, it might be a little earlier, might be helpful. But in general, from Morris down to the St. Paul region, mid-September. And planting beans on time is recommended. And if the challenge with the planting of the beans can be, in some years, if the Camelina starts to get fairly tall before you're ready to plant the beans. And that might force you to plant a little earlier than you would maybe otherwise want to plant the beans. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And the key there is you don't want the the Camelina can pop back up to an extent after planting beans, but if it gets to be where it's getting a lot of kind of pods on the Camelina, I'd say, probably 15, 20 inches tall. That's starting to get a little bit tall for the Camelina. So that's kind of a dance you have to navigate. So yeah, another thing to keep in mind, harvesting the Camelina in late June, early July. And then the beans, you'd harvest late September, early October, pretty typical time. So yeah, the ideal height of the Camelina is 6 to 9 inches for planting. If it gets a little taller, you might be okay, but yeah, when you're getting much past 1.5 feet or 2 feet, that's going to be where it's a challenge. And yeah, for harvesting, a typical combine can work well. There are a few adjustments that need to be made to harvest such a small seed. This is one example of something a grower did, putting these plastic tubing over the bean row to prevent clipping the beans and getting a little bit more of the Camelina at the same time. So a little more detail on this. If you have a flex head on the combine, if you can take the flex out of it, that's ideal. A soybean header works. Very small seed, so need the sieves to be tight, smaller openings than for wheat. Yeah, cylinder speed around 900 RPMs is good. And then, yeah, going light on the wind is recommended. I mean, it's kind of a balance. You don't want too many pods, mixed in unless you have access to some kind of cleaning after the fact. But if you can strike the balance where you're getting clean seed on a low wind setting, that's where you're going to be maximizing your harvest and keeping the seed clean. So it'll probably take a little bit of trial and error, and I'm sure Ann will have a little bit more detail on that as well. So
Here's a question, Matthew.
Oh, yeah.
Great. There's a question on markets, which I'll touch on a little bit after Ann has the chance to speak a little bit. But can this crop be grazed at all? Is that a use for it or not necessarily? Or do you know anything about that?
So I don't know if that has been extensively studied. I would say, if some growers are familiar with the Kernza work, as a perennial, Kernza seems to tolerate grazing well, but I guess I would expect it not to work on a winter annual like Camelina. It's doesn't have, an established root system in the fall. And it would rely on that rosette leaf for all of its photosynthesis work to put deeper roots in the spring and produce the stem and the flowers. It's, something that could be studied. I guess my expectation is that would be a challenge. So
yeah, I think this person is asking about, say if you have a really spotty stand, or if it could be part of a spring grazing component. I think that's mainly what they're asking.
Oh, I see. So yeah, okay, if you're not maybe going to harvest it for seed, and if you want to instead graze it. So there has been some feeding studies of the seed for different livestock, and a bit of a challenge on the seed, meal for feeding is the glucosinolate content. And glucosinolates are on this in the leaves as well. So that would be likely a challenge for livestock. Yeah, off the top of my head, I know that I think cattle do a little better than swine with glucosinolates, but neither one can tolerate a high percentage of that in their diet. So I think in terms of the meal, they kind of incorporate about a 10% camelina meal into like a 90% soybean meal, for example. So yeah, so that's a challenge in some sense, but the glucosinolates, on the flip side, also protect the crop from insect pests to an extent too. So there might be a silver lining with the glucosinolates. Yeah, I mean, they have a function for the plant in terms of protection, but it has a trade-off in terms of feed. So
Got you. Thanks for that. And Paul or Bruce in the chat, I'll drop my email, and if you could send me an email, I'll follow up with you. Just as a quick time check, we're probably got about another 5 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. So yeah, really quickly, the Camelina is good at weed suppression. This graph shows Camelina and pennycress compared to a fallow system, so much reduction in weed biomass. And there are weed control options for Camelina, and this is in our grower's guide as well. But if you want to take a screenshot of this information, yeah, that is something that would be good. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these right now, but you have an idea of some of the chemicals you can use for Camelina that have, the following crop in mind, and that's in the grower's guide. A little background on Camelina breeding just in the last few minutes here. So as I mentioned before, we have spring Camelina and winter Camelina. And this graph basically is just showing what I can sum up as we have, only about a dozen lines of winter Camelina. We have over 400 lines of spring Camelina. And the winter Camelina for these key traits is at or below average. So that informs our breeding strategy. What we really need to do is incorporate the kind of winter hardiness traits from the winter Camelina into the best lines of spring Camelina to improve the crop. And so that's the strategy I'm taking in my work. So little example on seed size here. I've got, a few spring lines of Camelina that are, the seed is all fairly small, but, it's can be double the size of our winter Camelina Joel that we typically have been using. So, just from the get-go, just pulling a line out of a seed bank, we can double the seed size. And once, I've made crosses, using Joel and other winter lines to these same lines you see here of the springs. And so I'm looking forward to integrating those winter hardiness traits into these backgrounds and getting a winter Camelina line with large seed size. And in terms of early maturity, this picture I just took a few weeks ago. We've got this kind of semi-winter line of Camelina. It's very winter hardy. Planted it on the same date on September 22nd as Joelle on the right. But it flowers early and matures early. So if you can get the crop off the field sooner, you're going to have less shade pressure on your soybean, less shade stress. And that can help with the soybean yield and a relay cropping system. And it could even work. They're doing some experiments with double cropping, where you're planting dry bean, millet, or sunflower after the harvest of, an earlier maturing Camelina. So that work is also showing promising results in terms of double cropping as well. And really quick, put some numbers on this. 2 locations. These lines that I've selected are maturing earlier than our other winter lines of Camelina. And they also have pretty good yields. So that's also exciting to see. You're getting a gain in terms of maturity without really much of a trade-off in terms of yields, which you don't really see that often in a similar kind of crop like barley, for example. So yeah, anyway, I can kind of wrap up there. I can answer some questions now or later as well. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. Really appreciate the information and kind of setting the stage for us in terms of some of the production basics on this crop. Appreciate your time there. And yes, thank you, Alexander Deemer from AURI mentioned in the chat as well. Just as a call out, if anybody is in the neighborhood or wants to hop in the car and drive, there's 2 oilseed field days happening tomorrow and Friday. Tomorrow at the USDA ARS station in Morris. There's oilseeds field day there. And there's one on Friday that Alexander mentioned, June 9th in Kirkston. So this will be opportunity to, connect with market partners, see these crops in the field, and would be a great place to get some more information if you have an interest there. And it looks like Alexander just shared the ARS information in the chat too. So definitely check those out. And with that, I'm going to bop things over to Ann to kind of give some ground truth, real world grower experience with growing Camelina. So take it away, Ann.
I'll stop my share.
Hi there. Good morning. It's still the morning here. Coming to you from St. Paul from my office. Let me share my screen and we can get going. Hi, so I am Ann Schwegel. I farm in western Minnesota along the border with South Dakota in Big Stone County near Beardsley, Minnesota. So just a little quick thing about me. I like to share this picture of me and my father-in-law, Jerry, on Who Wore It Better Day with his old-timey overalls and my very cute overalls. He loves when I share it too. He just loves when I put that picture of him up. But we, along with my husband, Peter, we own and operate Prairie Point Farm. We currently grow certified organic grain crops on our farm: corn, soybeans, oats, kernza, and winter camelina. Though we don't have any camelina in the ground right now, we intend to plant some more here this fall. We run about 820 acres of organic grain operation. And I have an off-farm job, which is what brings me to St. Paul today with Minnesota Farmers Union. I serve as the state vice president. But on our operation, oh, and I should make this, I'm looking at it just like it's, I gotta do like it's a real slideshow. Sorry about that. Play from current slide. There we go. On our operation, we have been working over the last, since we've more or less been certified in the last several years, of trying to figure out the puzzle of how do we take our organic operation and move it into a little bit more of a regenerative circle. Because the big knock on organic and fair enough, we do a lot of tillage. especially with row cropping. And so we're trying to figure out ways that we can minimize our tillage on our farm and, treat our soils a little bit nicer and try and, do what's best for our operation while still, being economically viable. We talk about resiliency a lot. Was it economically resilient? Is it environmentally resilient? How do we spread out our risk on the farm? So in September 2021, we signed up for, after being current growers for a year, we decided to try another brand new thing, and signed up through Forever Green Initiative to do this pilot project that they did in partnership with Embold to grow winter camelina on our operation. We planted in late September. I think our plant date was September 27th. Which was incredibly late. I mean, we could have followed it on soybean ground, but we did it on oat ground that year. We used our John Deere 455 drill, and you can see the picture on the far left of Jerry hand mixing, because that's what we had. We chose to use the equipment that we had. We hand mixed in oats as a nurse crop because of the very small seed side. We needed something to kind of bulk up the volume of what we were going to put out there for the camelina. The picture on the far right is me driving the tractor while my husband Peter just watches the drill as this experiment goes. We chose just like 12 acres. It was a pretty small kind of test plot for us to see how the camelina would behave on our operation. We have pretty heavy soil. We struggle a lot in the spring with drying out in time. In the last several years, we've had, late, wet, damp springs. This year being kind of no exception, except that, the spigot got turned off and we've been hot and dry since the end of April. And then the picture in the middle is of that spring rosette that Matt was talking about earlier. The oats winter killed really nicely, and the camelina came up really nice from the in the rows, and turned out pretty great. Matt talked about kind of the opportunity of relay cropping with soybeans on our operation. That was part of the pilot project. They wanted to test some real world operations of doing that. We decided not to do that because we're an organic operation and we cultivate our soybeans. We were really concerned about the amount of residue that would be left in the row from the camelina, because we don't really have a bailout method of using chemical herbicides. We didn't want to run the risk of having a complete crop failure on our soybeans if we couldn't cultivate them. So we wanted to see kind of what this additional cropping opportunity could be for us, and wanted to see, if we're doing something that is half season, what if we could do that double cropping, if we could choose something that has a short enough season to follow that. And we weren't able to quite get our act together enough last summer to do that, but it's still very much on our radar of what can we do to kind of increase that fall cover, fall, winter, early spring cover on our operation, while like increasing that triple bottom line for us. But similar thinking as with our, conventional neighbors, that we want to increase our kind of yield potential while minimizing our herbicides, or in our case, our tillage passes over the field. Each tillage pass costs money and diesel and iron. So we're in our time. That's an important one too. So, in May, our experience growing it, we had a late wet spring, and it was really nice to have, another one of these winter annuals in the ground that I didn't have to worry about wedging in additional acres for my row crop production in a very compacted planting window last spring. And that was fortunate because on May 30th, we had just gotten our corn in the ground, and we had started planting our beans, and we got a like 4 inches in an hour, pounding rain. It was the one that brought the derecho to, well, Morris, where Matt is. We were spared the derecho winds, but we got a really kind of devastating rain that messed up most of our row crop acres for the year. And the camelina, which was of course already in the ground. This is the camelina in the foreground. I'm pointing at my screen. The camelina in the foreground, and then what was going into soybeans next to it. And you can see we have a draw through that quarter where it's still wet and really struggling to dry out. And we had a fair bit of drown out on this quarter here, and ended up fighting weeds for a good chunk of the year. The camelina, on the other hand, really stood strong with it through that draw. It stayed clean. And it just popped right back up following that really driving rain. This is the field in late June. See, there is my husband. He does exist. And we had some folks come out from we were looking at maybe using soybean or using camelina in crush plants. And they were asking us, what's your herbicide program on this field? And we said, we're organic. We don't have a herbicide program. And it was the cleanest. It was like the greatest compliment that my little organic farming heart could have. Cause it was this untouched field was the cleanest field on our operation, frankly. We ended up harvesting it a little bit later than we had wanted to due to some combine issues. We run a gleaner combine that did do a pretty good job, but we ended up having a little bit of shatter loss as a result. That's for sure just because of things that happened on our operation last year. But we went through and we combined it in mid-July, excuse me. And it yielded about 1,200 pounds an acre, so a little bit lower. And I think that was part of the shatter loss that we ended up getting a little bit lower of a yield than kind of what the U was expecting. But we came through it. It did well. We were pretty impressed with how it came through the combine. You see some pods in that picture. But I think that is to be expected. That was it was a relatively clean sample that came through, and Matt wasn't wrong. You really got to make sure everything is shut down tight on your combine and your wagons. Make sure you don't use your wagon that has a hole in the bottom that leaks like a sieve, because the camelina will come through it. But it managed pretty well, and they took it straight out of the Embold U of M partnership. The folks who were handling it was at the time Milborn Seeds in Brookings. Brookings.
Yep. Yeah.
They came and took it straight out of the field, which worked out well for everyone, I think. So we didn't have to worry about storage, because that was going to be an issue. We have slat bottomed 18-foot grain bins, and there was a concern that if we had to store it, if it would leak through the bottom of our grain bin. So that would be, I think, if we were growing it again, we'd have to take into some kind of consideration of how we would store it on the farm if we can't move it straight out of the field. But what makes me pretty excited is what we're seeing this year on that same ground. Now, because we had that shatter loss, we did have some regrowth, here in the spring of 23. And that was fine. It terminated just fine with a field cultivator. What I am excited about, oh shoot, it's not wanting to go forward. There we go. Is the side-by-side comparison of where on the left side of the picture, you can see where that was soybean grown all year, and it got that pounding 4-inch rain, which we can kind of expect now that we're going to get one storm that's going to be 4 inches in an hour, right? A year. We have been getting them once a year for the last, half dozen years, either somewhere in May, June, or July, right? When the crop is still pretty young, and it causes pretty significant nutrient loss and crusting issues or lumping issues. The right side of the picture is where that camelina was. and we planted a cover crop following it last fall. And then the Camelina, we had some regrowth here this spring, but it terminated really nicely. The soil, it's a stark contrast for us between what was in soybeans last year and what had the Camelina in a cover. The Camelina cover has a much more mallow ground. We've got pretty decent weed control in it. No clumping, and it's our best corn stand on the farm right now. The soybeans into corn field is lumpier because it got that really pounding rain, and we're dealing with increased weed pressure in that field, not having near the amount of weed control. And these pictures were taken yesterday on a pretty hot day. Things are pretty darn dry right now. So having this kind of lumpy, crusty ground is tough to, get a good corn stand going on it. And so it's exciting for us to kind of see, that Matt described it as ground truthing. And I think that is what it is. I don't have any hard data behind what's causing this, but I can see it for my very own eyes, the difference between having, just straight row crop rotation and having, this winter cover, this winter annual plus a cover, and the difference that it makes for that following cash crop the next year. I'm excited about the corn that's on that 12-acre passage. No, it's not the whole thing, and it's relatively small, but it is kind of, the proof is in the pudding for us, the benefits of having those kinds of additional crops in our rotation. And I think that's it for slides for me. I know I really rushed through that. So if folks have questions, I'm really happy to take anything. We can just talk or shoot the breeze.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Ann. Love the pictures, and thank you very much for taking the time to put that together and sharing that with everybody. Did you have to, in terms of equipment, did you have to make any other modifications combine wise or anything like that?
No, so we, as Matthew said before, we had the fan turned down on the combine, and everything set pretty darn tight. It was a slower fan than for the rest of our crops. And then as far as other equipment goes, no, we used our pretty old drill, minimum till drill. I think, on the equipment wish list, pretty high up right now is a no-till drill with a grass seeder attachment, so we can more effectively handle these kinds of crops. It's not a ton of fun to hand mix oats and Camelina in a bushel basket.
Got a pretty good,
no.
From seeding through the grain box, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was very much like this is an experiment. I think if we were doing it for cash and yield. Oh, and I didn't mention, we did spring apply fertilizer. We did about 50 pounds an acre. And we use a pelleted poultry manure for our operation. And we did it ahead of a rain just to kind of get it to soak in.
Gotcha.
I forgot about that one. Yeah, I see the question in the chat. Does this have to be dried after harvest? No, we took it and it was dry. I think we took it a little too dry because of the shatter loss, but we had a death in the family, so our whole summer got screwed up as a result. Life stuff happens. But I think if we had taken it kind of when we had anticipated, late June or around the 4th of July, I still don't anticipate that we would have had to dry it. I think we just would have had less shatter loss.
Did you have quite a bit of volunteers coming up in the spring of 23?
Fair bit. Nothing that was proved to be a problem. It terminates really pretty easily in the spring.
One pass, essentially.
One pass. Yeah, one pass. And the ground, I mean, walking out on it, it's pretty mallow. I always say, I'm not a soil scientist, so I don't have data for why things are the way they are, but I can feel it with my feet, under my feet. It's good mallow ground, good for planting a crop into.
It's great.
Since it
so for Camelina harvest, I think the target moisture is between 8 and 10%, so that's pretty dry as it is. I know Russ Gesh with USDA has done some experimentation with both swatting and spraying if you're not an organic producer to kind of hasten that maturity a little bit. But I
Sure.
think based on its architecture, you're probably still best off letting it, get fully mature and then just taking it
In
when
the
it's
field.
alive.
Yeah, I mean, we cut it with a straight cut combine. I think if you were trying to relay crop, swathing wouldn't be an option just to windrow it.
Yep.
And it was just nice to be able to take it pretty efficiently with the straight cut combine. Matthew, did you have a comment?
Oh, yeah. I was curious of what Milborn said about having some pods mixed in. Did they have any issue or no? They just
Maybe you could ask our partners at Forever Green. After they took it, we didn't hear anything from them. So
okay. Yeah, because if it's okay to have, if Milborn can kind of handle that, that might be a way to, prevent some of the seed blowing out the back, is if you have some of the pods staying in too.
sure. If you're less concerned.
Right. Yeah. If someone doesn't mind cleaning it, you could get a little more yield that way, probably, because you'll lose
that initial post-harvest processing would be great. Alexandra had a question about other groups that are doing that. And I'm not aware of any groups, hubs, or cooperatives in development offhand. And then contracts, I know of a couple, but I don't know what their status is for this. I knew of a couple planting ahead of last fall. We did not plant any last fall because it was super dry. When we were pretty sure that nothing and not much would germinate. So we had
So to kind of bring back the marketing angle a little bit. So yeah, like Ann mentioned, that there are some pre-contracted options for oil seeds, but it's fairly limited. So Yield 10 is one company and they're actively contracting now. They have a crush plant in southern Canada and they're looking to put that into fruition. So folks in Minnesota are definitely on the table there. There's another company out of Montana called Sustainable Oils. They are contracting as well, more so in North Dakota. So it's not quite as relevant to this crowd. And then, I think in the short term, there's a pretty big demand for seed. So Milborn, Albert Lee Seed, other regional seed companies. I think there's probably a fair amount of play there just as using it as a cover crop. But I think as the years go on here, we will see more regional development for oil seed use specifically. So yes, and I guess would be the short answer there. Want to be cognizant of folks' time too. We are at noon, so any last questions to put in the chat? Otherwise, I want to say again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Ann and Matthew for being generous with your time. And just as a call out for next week, we have a couple more webinars coming up. Tuesday, the 13th on Kernza, and then Wednesday, the 14th on hybrid rye. So feel free to join in. And again, if you'd like to rewatch, we'll be uploading this to our YouTube page. Take care.
Yep. See you, everyone. Thank you all for hopping on the call.